Everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's Institute for Government webinar. I'm Emma Norris, the Deputy Director of the Institute. We're going to be getting out the crystal balls and looking ahead to roughly 48 hours from now, because by Friday lunchtime, and judging by the latest polls, possibly even a bit earlier than that, the general election is going to be over. The votes will have been counted and we'll know which party is going to form the next government. All the polls suggest that Labour's almost certainly going to be that party. But Rishi Sunak is still holding out hopes, in public at least, of doing a Jude Bellingham and staying in the game. We'll see. But whether Friday is day one of a newly elected Labour government or day one of a re-elected Conservative government, it's going to be a huge day for everyone involved. So what should civil servants expect on that first day? What does day one look like for a new Prime Minister? When do ministerial appointments start rolling in? What does Friday hold for people hoping to become special advisors? And what are the big moments that go on behind the famous number 10 door? To discuss all of that and more, I'm joined by a fantastic panel who have all worked in government at these moments of historic change and heightened political drama. They've seen it all close up. So with us, we've got our senior fellow, Jill Rutter, who in a former life worked at the Treasury and in number 10. Alex Thomas, who runs our civil service programme and has worked in lots of different government departments, including during transition. And Salma Shah, who's worked as a special advisor for a number of Conservative ministers, including the former Home Secretary, Sajid Javid. So for those of you watching, please do start sending in your questions on the Slido bar next to the live feed. I'm going to try to get through as many as possible in the next hour, but I'm going to use the chair's prerogative to start with a few of my own. Alex, how is Friday morning going to look for civil servants in terms of meetings and diaries? Is it a case of just turning up and arriving at work as usual and waiting, or is there more than that going on?
There's a bit of that, and I suppose the first thing to say, I feel like I say there's quite a lot of things like this, but is for the vast majority of civil servants, the 500,000 civil servants in the country, it will be quite a normal day. They'll be turning up to work in prisons, in job centres, all across the country. And while they might be aware of the election, it won't affect their lives. But yeah, for that group of civil servants working in central policy departments, and particularly for those working in number 10 and near the centre of government, it will be very different. And they will all have been following the polls, following the campaign, seeing what would happen, doing their day one briefs and all the other kind of preparations that civil servants do. And then Friday is the day when all that starts to be put into action. I suppose it kind of ripples out from the centre of government. So the Prime Minister, if there is a change, would go to the Palace to be appointed. They'd then come back to Downing Street. They'd probably make a speech outside, but then the civil service role kicks in when the Cabinet Secretary, the head of the civil service, and the Prime Minister's principal private secretary, so their kind of head of office and the head of Downing Street, will meet them at the door. Then the civil servants in number 10 will line up to clap the Prime Minister in to welcome them. And then the Cabinet Secretary and the Principal Private Secretary will sit down with the Prime Minister and start taking them through all the briefing and the work they've done. Then, as ministerial appointments are made, and I'm sure we'll get into this over the course of the discussion, individual ministers will be appointed to departments, and then the civil servants in those departments will be gearing up to meet those ministers on Friday afternoon, maybe over the weekend. Private secretaries and permanent secretaries in all those departments will be sitting down and meeting ministers and doing the same thing, but on an individual scale as what happened in number 10. And then probably over the course of next week and the weeks after, that's when it really affects the majority of policy civil servants who will be summoned to meetings with ministers to introduce their policy areas, to talk about some of the knotty problems that they've been working on.
And Alex, you've touched on what it feels like for a Prime Minister as well. Tell us a bit more about what their first day looks like. You mentioned briefings. What are the first things they're being handed by civil servants when they walk in that door?
Yeah, so I suppose there are sort of three big jobs three big kind of streams of work for the Prime Minister to do. The first and most obvious is making all the ministerial appointments. So they hopefully will have done a bit of planning about who they want to appoint. And so almost straight away, they'll launch into appointing the cabinet, having meetings with the people who they want to appoint to big jobs, maybe disappointing some people who thought they were going to get one job and they're giving another. So there's a stream of activity around ministerial appointments. There's then all the policy work and security work that the civil service has been working on. So one of the first things, or the early things that a Prime Minister does, is sign these letters of last resort, the instructions to the captains of the nuclear submarines about what would happen if, God forbid, we're not here anymore. That's a really important and serious moment, but there's also a bit of theatre, I always think, around that. The kind of this is an important job and a serious job. So the cabinet secretary and the security and military briefings that come with that. The cabinet secretary will have prepared a day one brief saying, we've read your manifesto. Here are the sorts of decisions that we think you might want to start taking to enact that manifesto. I think for Labour, there will be a discussion about what mission-driven government actually means and how the civil service can start to implement that. The civil service will also have the kind of less pleasant job of saying, here are all the impossible problems that have been stored up over the general election campaign. From Friday onwards, I think that will be prisons, public sector pay, Thames Water, all these kind of things on that we've been hearing about have been stored up over the campaign. And then the third thing, really important not to forget for the Prime Minister, is this is a bizarre and extraordinary thing that we're asking them to do, and it's an enormous upheaval for their personal lives. So they will also be making decisions about where they want to live, how they want to use Downing Street, being briefed on their own personal security, where their kids and how their kids might get to school, all of those kind of things that that you shouldn't overlook for this kind of sort of completely overwhelming experience that a Prime Minister's doing. Some of that will have been discussed in advance, but until the rubber really hits the road, you can't actually know how it's going to feel.
And Salma, there are also the political advisors sitting there and waiting to see what happens. And we might have a new load of special advisors on Friday. What are they doing on the Friday morning? Are they all congregating in one place together? How does it feel?
Well, sometimes they might congregate. I think other times they're going to be doing what their bosses are doing and waiting to see what job they're going to get and which department they're going to go into. But of course, political advisors are sort of, when you come into the civil service, nobody really cares about you. They're focused on the minister. So you've got to sort of find your way through. I think if I'm sort of going to do the other side of the coin to what Alex has just described, I think for a lot of special advisors, they won't necessarily understand that there is this huge wave of information that's about to come at them. So their day one briefings, not just in number 10, but also in government departments. I never worked in the centre, I worked out in departments. And I think that all those problems that are stored up, the things that they don't know, I think is going to be a big surprise to them. And the structure of who they deal with and how they deal with them. So if you're coming in from opposition, let's just assume for a moment that it's Labour that is going to form the next government. And you've got people who have never done government before. And you are coming in from what is essentially a small, tight team where your chain of command might be 3 people. And going into an organisation where the chain of command might be 30 people and you're not quite sure where you sit in that chain of command, and the civil service isn't quite sure where you sit in that chain of command. And you've got to work all that out. So there's this huge sort of pressure because you don't really understand where you fit. And that's a process as well. So day one is going to be very confusing, I think, for a lot of those people. I think there's something interesting that always happens day one, is that, as Alex said, you go into number 10 and the civil servants applaud the Prime Minister that's walking in, which is a lovely gesture, and that often happens for Secretaries of State as well. But I've often sort of mused at the fact that nobody really claps you on your way out whenever you leave your job, however you leave your job. So it's nice, but it is also quite odd. And I think when you go in as a special advisor, you're a bit like, why are you all applauding? You don't know us and we don't know you. So it can be quite strange. There's sort of customs and things if you're not used to it.
So Jill, it's a big and slightly weird day, but it's also a big night the night before. What's your advice for government officials? Should they be trying to get their sleep in whilst they can, or should they be trying to follow every twist and turn from, exit poll onwards?
As Alex said, for an awful lot of civil servants, it really won't make any difference. I mean, they shouldn't be expecting that if you're sort of, working in a sort of quite niche part of a department, that a minister's first act on appointment will be to summon you into their office to get to know you. The first job I did in government, very big changeover, absolutely made zero difference to the job I was doing. You could just enjoy the election like everybody else. And actually, most civil servants' jobs were a bit like that. If you are expected to be on call, I think one of the things you do need to do is to be ready. Not to be offended if you don't make it to the top of the list that day, but to be ready. There was a sort of quite interesting comment by a civil servant in a paper that was quoted today saying, we'd be told to turn up dressed, in a suit and tie, assuming that was a male civil servant, and ready to stay around till 6 o'clock. And I wonder if they think we're going to do that expletive deleted. My view is if you think like that, you basically could be working in the civil service. I mean, this is the absolute essence of what being a civil servant is about being ready to show that you can work one day perfectly well for one set of ministers, and the next day you are ready and good to go for the next set, and should be very, very exciting. So I would say, get a bit of sleep, be ready to be on the ball. Don't be sort of grumpy and tetchy. That would be really, really bad, because you really want to make a very positive first impression. But don't expect that that first impression will necessarily happen on day one. You might be waiting until the first week. You might be waiting for weeks more. One of the pieces of advice, though, I would give to ministers is that a lot of ministers, Salma was saying, they're used to working in very close-knit groups, and they often find it quite weird that so many civil servants want to pile in to an early meeting. I think, when I was working at the Treasury, we got that very, very wrong with Gordon Brown, where everybody wanted to pile into his first meetings, and clearly that was not his style at all, whereas it very much had been the style of earlier chancellors. But I do think to ministers, it is very useful to civil servants, particularly those who are going to have to represent you to other departments or externally, to be given opportunities to get on your wavelengths by hearing you talking about your policy priorities in your own terms. And if you say, well, actually, we can just tell them what we've decided, I don't need these people, I'm very happy to read the brief and make a decision, you actually miss a big opportunity to recruit the department to your side and get people understanding. And it's hugely valuable early on to be able to say, well, actually, I was speaking to the Chancellor, the Home Secretary a couple of days ago, and they really feel very, very strongly about that. That's hugely valuable currency across Whitehall. And I would encourage ministers to be as open as they feel comfortable with the civil service early on.
Salma.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree with Jill there, because I think one of the difficulties is that all these civil servants come piling in, and you think, well, what do you all do? Because you're so used to, in your mindset, thinking, well, we've gotten here with this tiny team, and you don't actually fundamentally understand your organization and the flow of information. And it's so important that people are in the room and hear it from the horse's mouth. I also think that if you don't do that, you start the relationship off on the wrong foot from the political side, because that dissemination of information and making sure that everyone's on the same page in vast organizations is absolutely critical in terms of being able to communicate. So, we may get onto this, what does mission-led government mean? But if it means anything, it means being able to disseminate that information well, and so that everybody can understand it. And one of the trends that I think has been terrible over the last possibly 20 years is emasculating civil servants from being able to contribute ideas. And I definitely made this mistake. I have been guilty of this, and this is why I say this now, having made the mistake and having learned from it, is that great ideas can come from within the civil service, because quite often they've seen things that have worked and haven't worked before, and they can bring you that institutional knowledge. So you have to do your best to make good use of that, and not think that because it's alien to you that something doesn't work. I think be open, be welcoming, understand those ideas, build those relationships, do it from day one, because if you lose that momentum, then actually you're doing yourself a disservice.
Alex.
Thanks, Emma. I mean, great to hear Salma say that from a special advisor's point of view, because I think that's exactly right. Sometimes the civil service doesn't get the language quite right, and might say something that is a bit offbeat with ministers or special advisors. But it's really worth on both sides trying to kind of get beyond that and to and see what's underneath. Also, I mean, special advisors and ministers do need to challenge the civil service. It's not sort of a purely accepting relationship. But what I was going to say was just to build on something Jill was saying. There can be in departments around transitions, but this happens during reshuffles as well, a bit of an unseemly scramble amongst the senior civil servants to try and get in the room with ministers to really put themselves forward to kind of develop and build that currency that Jill was talking about. And I suppose the thing I'd say to everybody on that is just, calm down, that there's plenty of time. This is a government, if it is as we expect, it will probably be in office for quite a long time. And yes, it is important to build those relationships, and the civil service will be super keen to do so. But there is a risk, again, of the scramble that actually puts off ministers and special advisors. And so just kind of be prepared to be kind of calm and measured in all of that. To also agree with Jill, I think if you're in a minister-facing or a potentially minister-facing job and you don't want to be around in a shirt and tie or whatever the appropriate attire is on Friday morning and beyond to do that, then you're probably in the wrong job, because this is the moment for the civil service. This is when it proves itself. This is when it re-legitimizes itself. So kind of get with the program on that one. Just on watching the election, share what Jeremy Hayward did. I worked with him in the 2017 election, and I was intrigued by his method of watching it, because obviously he had to be on form on the Friday to do all the things. But what he did was he watched the exit poll and the start of the election, then went to sleep for a few hours, and then watched the rest of it early in the morning on sort of double speed, because he didn't want to miss anything, but he did need to have a few hours sleep. So I share that as a tip for any ambitious civil servants who want to watch the election, but also be on form on Friday.
Alex, let's just talk a little bit more about ministerial appointments. Do we know much about the timetable for this week? How quickly are we likely to see, for instance, cabinet appointments happening? Labour have said there's probably going to be quite a lot of stability. So does that mean it'll happen quite quickly if they win?
I think it probably will. So if they win, and if it's a majority government and we don't have coalition negotiations or any uncertainty about who the Prime Minister is, I would expect it to happen pretty quickly. So let's say lunchtime on Friday, when the previous Prime Minister's resigned and Keir Starmer's gone to the palace and gone into Downing Street, you would expect it to be pretty quick through the course of Friday afternoon to have probably most or even all of the cabinet by the end of Friday. Sometimes how it's gone in the past is you might have a kind of the big appointments first, so the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Angela Rayner, the Foreign Secretary, the Home Secretary would come first, and then over the course of the afternoon you'll get the appointments coming in. Our expectation is that there'll be a fair amount of stability from the shadow team to the ministerial appointments. So again, that would help speed it up. Equally, there may be, if a shadow minister loses their seat, then that will present the Prime Minister with a question about who they want to appoint. There's also just a little thing, and we're all in favour of stability, and I think it is really good if shadow ministers can be appointed to their briefs. But this will be the moment of the Prime Minister's maximum power. So if there are any really kind of big changes that they might want to make, and actually if they've come in with a big majority, then that is the moment when a Prime Minister might decide to do something radical. I'm not expecting that on Friday, but you never know.
Thanks, Alex. Jill, when that new minister arrives into a department, how significant is that? How important is their first speech to the people in the department?
Well, this is something that didn't really used to happen. I think the sort of town hall is now much more of an expectation than it used to be, particularly with people able to dial in. I think if the minister feels ready, it's good to do it. I don't think it necessarily needs to be on the Friday afternoon. They may have other things they want to do, but I think it's very good if they can make sure that they let people know that they are going to do something. There'll be an opportunity for the whole department to hear from the new Secretary of State. You might want to wait until you can introduce the entire ministerial team. I think that's not a bad thing, and that's quite interesting, particularly if you can then explain how you're carving up the jobs and maybe set a bit of expectation of what you're like as a team, because although we may expect stability in the cabinet, there may be some quite different appointments at junior ministerial level, and people won't be nearly as well acquainted with those faces. And an awful lot of civil service interactions will actually be with the junior ministers rather than with the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State doesn't want to give the sense that these people count for absolutely nothing, or probably doesn't. We'll see how that all works. So I think I would schedule it pretty quickly. There are sort of other interesting things, particularly with dispersion. When is the Secretary of State first going to visit some of the other offices? Because you have, is this entirely Whitehall focused, or when will they be going, say in the case of the Treasury and the Department of Business and Trade, up to the Darlington campus, or go and see, you know, people in Leeds or Wolverhampton or wherever. So I think that's quite an important diary thing to get going. So I think it is a good thing to do. It's really good if you can say what you want the department to do. And actually, this is one of the things that coming in from opposition gives people a big advantage over people who've suddenly been reshuffled in. If you're reshuffled into a department, Salma, I'm sure will have views on this, you probably haven't been thinking that much about the agenda for the department you're just moved into. It's slightly, they really want me to be Home Secretary now. I wasn't expecting that. And you won't come in with a big agenda, but it's really useful to say, these are my big priorities in the department. This is where I want to go. But making clear as well that actually everybody matters. You don't want to give the sense of, well, I'm only here to do one thing. I remember with the Secretary of State that we worked for, this was after a reshuffle. It took him really a long time before we could persuade him even to have a very quick briefing with the people who ran one of the sort of areas he was clearly profoundly uninterested in, but had the potential, if something went wrong, to cost him his job and cost the department its future existence. But it took us about 6 months into his appointment before he could be persuaded to have any sort of briefing with that team. So I do think sort of, you know, actually getting across the whole portfolio very quickly is really important, just to understand what your department is, who the people are, what it looks like, and where some of those early issues are. But I think don't feel obliged to do it on a Friday, potentially early the following week. And one of the things that's also really interesting is, where does the Prime Minister go? Does the Prime Minister go and visit any government department and say, you're a department, you're absolutely critical to delivering my missions? Does he go to mission departments? Who knows? But I think that's really quite another thing that civil service will be watching out for, and probably massively over-interpreting. And that's one of the things I would say is cut everybody a bit of slack. People are tired. They've been through a grueling election campaign. You might think, he's not interested in my thing, he's not read my brief. Is that slight? Don't read too much into things too early, because it's always a bit chaotic at the start, and there are huge numbers of other demands on people's attention. And some of them, as Alex said, are just sorting out some of the personal issues about, you know, am I going to be able to get the kids to school on time? How am I going to manage my constituency work? How do I work with this new team? I didn't expect to get X as my apparent number 2.
Salma.
Just one thing that has come to mind, because Jill mentioned it, you know, waiting to give the speech to, or the town hall to the department with the teams in place. There's this thing that I think lots of people forget about secretaries of state and their junior ministers, is that the Secretary of State doesn't choose their junior ministers, the Prime Minister does. And I think senior civil servants who are long in the tooth are aware of this dynamic, because the department will work to everybody in line with the order of you know, where they are in the ministerial ranking within the department. So, you know, you've got your PAS, your MOS, your SOS. But that's not necessarily how the dynamic is going to work in the department. And it's just a tip to be mindful of that, because there will be kind of interpersonal issues at play as well between those ministerial teams, and that selection process is not in the Secretary of State's control. And so the influence that a certain minister may have on a certain policy, depending on their relationship with the leader's team, could be better in some instances than the Secretary of State. And the way that those ministers will interact with the Secretary of State is also going to be very important when you consider policy delivery and, you know, where it goes up in the priority and the pecking order. The other thing I just want to allude to, something that Alex talked about earlier as well, is the personal aspect. And, you know, when you go into a different department, there's one thing particularly for those ministers who are now going to be protected and suddenly have a huge protection team and a security team around them. That aspect of it that comes into the diary when you've got all your meetings and when you've got to think about possibly kids, family, what are you doing? That is really, really important when it comes to the diary, because everybody always forgets that the minister needs to eat, that the minister is a human being and maybe is going to need to sleep at some points as well. So if you're a civil servant and you're looking at how you're putting those things in, and if you've got the pressure of protected ministers as well, try and be kind to them and remember that they're going to need some 10-minute breaks in between, because it is so overwhelming. And just remembering that they're a person at the end of this as well is, I think, going to be really appreciated by the person you're helping.
Salma, how does it feel to be a special advisor walking into a new government department for the first time?
Well, it depends if you've ever done it before. I mean, I went through 4 reshuffles with Sajid and followed him to each department. So, you know, by the end, I was just like, yeah, another day. I know the process, know how this goes. When I walked into my first department, I came in because Maria Miller had been fired from government and Sajid had been promoted. So I was sort of just another person that was fitting into the machine, and that's very different. Right now, you're going to have a load of people that work together, have loads of camaraderie because they've come through an election campaign, again, assuming it's going to be a Labour victory. And they're all of a sudden going to be displaced in all these different places across Whitehall, and they're going to have their own silos and their own little fiefdoms that are going to grow underneath them. And it's actually quite a lonely place if there's just 2 of you special advisors and you know nobody else there. And so, you know, it's one of those things that I probably would have resisted, but, you know, a little bit of a social introduction for the special advisors as well to the team is probably quite helpful. Go and ask them for a coffee, or, you know, take them out of the cadence of briefing meetings and all the rest of it, because they probably won't want to admit it. But, you know, everybody feels out of their depth when you walk in, you get handed a BlackBerry or whatever they give you now, and you have an email, and all of a sudden, you know, you look away from your computer and you look back and there's 400 emails. So there is that point that actually, you know, most people do feel out of their depth when they go in, and you're expected to know all the answers, because it's like, gosh, well, you know the minister and you know what they think about this, and the truth is you don't. You're working it out together. So a little bit of human kindness towards the SPADs as well would be, I think, a good idea.
Jill?
Yeah, Emma, I think Salma's made an incredibly good point there, because actually I think one of the most daunting transitions is not so much for the minister, but for the special advisors. The sort of civil service machine obviously focuses on the new minister. There's a support structure in place that they can sort of slot into around the private office. But then we see the special advisor is possibly, you know, if there are 2 or 3 special advisors, one maybe dealing with the media, which means the entire policy agenda of the department is split between 2 special advisors. If they've been shadowing in opposition, they may have some sort of ideas. Everybody basically wants to get a steer from that special advisor on how is this new advice I'm putting in going to land with the new ministerial team. They'll be wanting to tap into the special advisor and say, actually, is this a coherent ministerial team? Does the Secretary of State really pay any attention to the Minister of State or the Parliamentary Under Secretary? Or are they actually there because they represent a different faction? So actually getting the Minister of State on board probably means that the Secretary of State, almost out of principle, might disagree with your advice. I mean, how is that dynamic working? We saw some of that in previous governments where they were used as faction balancing rather than as ways of creating a sort of big effective team. And some of the people who are absolutely critical here, I think, to sort of manage workflow, but also to share intelligence about what are these new working relationships like, you know, actually, does the Secretary of State really listen to the special advisor? Does that matter? Are the private offices? And I think the private offices have an absolutely critical role, if you like, lubricating the transition for everybody, both in interpreting the department for the Secretary of State, but also vitally when you've got a changeover in transmitting to the department, this is not going quite right, you're hitting the wrong tone here. Actually, the Secretary of State won't look at anything that's not been given the imprimatur by the special advisor. And by the way, that special advisor has just been hit by 25 issues that are more important than yours, so don't expect anything very quickly. And I think that's really quite difficult in those early weeks to prevent the special advisors and the Secretary of State's almost inevitable desire to get their input, because they're the people they know and are comfortable with, into every policy decision. One of the really big, difficult issues early on is how to get some flow of decision making going through without that just becoming a huge blockage.
And Jill, we've been talking about, new ministers, new special advisors. I've got a few questions coming in about the permanency or otherwise of the civil service. In the event that there is a change of government, what are your kind of crystal ball predictions on whether permanent secretaries will be sticking around, whether anybody might be moving, announcing they're stepping down? What do you think?
Is that to me? I think that this is a government that has been, this is potentially a government that has been quite critical of some of the ways in which the previous government treated relations with the civil service. We have to remember that Keir Starmer is an ex-permanent secretary, used to sit round the Wednesday morning meeting of permanent secretaries when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, and he also has quite a lot of civil servants in the leader's office. And I think they will want to do things properly and be seen to have what they might regard as a grown-up relationship with the civil service and an appreciation of the role of the civil service. That said, there will be some permanent secretaries who have had their terms slightly extended so that they will be there just for the handover, and you might expect to see them moving on maybe in a matter of months. There will be, we've already had some briefings that the Cabinet Secretary has set a deadline for his own departure. I don't know quite where that's come from, in which case they may want to kick off some sort of competition around recruiting a new Cabinet Secretary and maybe want to accelerate the timetable slightly. But I think we haven't quite got into the situation that the Australians now have got themselves into, where there's pretty much a presumption that most permanent secretaries' jobs are pretty much on the line in the days after a change of power. Indeed, it's precisely to be able to manage some of that continuity that we value a permanent impartial civil service. That's why we don't go over to have loads of political appointees. So it is a chance to show that. I think one of the things that really rankled about the Truss government's immediate sacking of Tom Scholar was that it didn't give Tom Scholar any time to show whether he could work successfully with Kwasi Kwarteng as Chancellor. And I'm absolutely sure that an incoming government will want to avoid any repeat of that episode. So I don't expect overnight firings of that sort, but there will always be some areas where the relationship just doesn't work and confidence is lost. And what then happens, and we saw this in the Treasury in 1979 and again in 1997, is that at those times, the permanent secretary was shuffled out after a sort of decent interval. The department rearranged itself so that de facto the Chancellor was looking to other people for their main advice, and the respective former permanent secretaries passed go and collected their peerages and went on to to collect quite a lot of chairmanships elsewhere.
Thanks,
Alex.
thanks, Emma. I mean, I think the other point I was going to make earlier, actually, I'll make first, which is going back to the sort of wave of stuff that is going to hit ministers and special advisors. And it's a point our colleague Jack Whirlidge made when we were talking about it yesterday, actually, about risk. And I think it would repay the civil service to remember that new ministers and new special advisors are coming from an environment where they could control things and they could control what they said and how they said it, into an environment where they're not controlling a lot of stuff. And so every parliamentary question answer, every FOI request, every piece of correspondence is a potential bomb that could go off. And I think the civil service needs to have that mindset when you're giving advice to new ministers and you're sort of inducting them into the job, that they will quite understandably actually be a bit paranoid about all the kind of what might be buried in these mountains of information. So that will gum up the system for a little while, and I think the civil service has a job to help guide them through and sort of expose the material that they're showing, and that will mean that it takes longer for policy lines to be signed off or parliamentary questions. Just while I'm speaking on the appointments and picking up on Jill's point, there is something about principal private secretaries. We've fallen into a bit of a convention recently, since Boris Johnson in particular, but also slightly Theresa May, that the principal private secretary to the Prime Minister, really important post, changes almost automatically with each Prime Minister. I suspect that's likely to happen again, but that's not necessarily a good thing. Clearly, there's a chemistry point about ministers and their private secretaries working together, and that's been absolutely fine. But there is a bit of a risk to continuity if we just assume that the private office turns around and turns over when a minister does. So I think exactly the same principles that Jill was talking about with permanent secretaries could and should apply to private secretaries as well.
And Alex, sometimes when a new government comes in, there's also machinery changes, new departments kind of squashed together. How much are we likely to see that in the event of a Labour victory? Obviously, a kind of centrepiece of Labour's pitch is missions. Do you think that's going to involve lots of changes to the structures of government?
So we'll see. It's the big question. It's the big IFG question. So we're watching and waiting to follow all of that with interest. I suspect the sense is, but this might be proved wrong very, very quickly, that we shouldn't expect really big fundamental machinery of government changes to the departments of state. So I'd be surprised if we saw a big Foreign Office or Home Office or other reorganisation or another machinery of government change. What I would expect is some sense of how a Labour government, if it is a Labour government, will operate at the centre. There's been some talk of creating these sort of mission boards, and so some reorganisation around the Cabinet Office and Number 10. We've made various recommendations in that space about creating a new department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet, and slimming down the Cabinet Office and shifting and turning that into a sort of new set of departments. So it would be really interesting what they do there. I think the other thing they're also likely to do, I can't imagine the Levelling Up department keeping its name for that much longer, so there might be some rebranding, and there'll also be bits and bobs around the edges that maybe ministers do a bit of horse trading with the Prime Minister, that they'd really like that little bit of policy from a department. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was some shifting around the edges of departments, but probably, famous last words, not a big machinery of government change.
Salma.
Just to say, machinery of government changes never achieve anything, and I think if whoever's going to form the next government needs to be very clear that a rebranding is not going to actually deliver anything on policy. I feel so strongly about this, but that's not the point that I was going to make. It was something that Jill said, and I'm throwing this out there as opposed to having a definitive view on it. But you said, Keir Starmer sat around the Perm Sec table and has that experience. You also have Sue Gray, an ex-senior civil servant who's presumably going to come in as Chief of Staff if Labour get that majority. And I wonder, because there is supposed to be that delineation between civil servant and politician, whether there's going to be a little bit of the frustrated civil servant in both potentially Keir Starmer as Prime Minister and potentially Sue Gray as Chief of Staff, because that dynamic is also going to change if you have lots of people who did that job before.
Alex, how do you think that transition will feel for Starmer and Gray, who have, as Salma said, both been in very senior official positions in the past?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and it's a really good thought. Salma, I agree with that. It will be very interesting to watch. I think there is a world in which this means that civil service will get on quite well with Keir Starmer and Sue Gray because they'll be able to talk the same language. But there is another world in which you lose that sort of political grit in the oyster that is crucial to the civil service being maybe a bit less risk averse or challenging itself to do things in a different way. I mean, for me, that comes back to the relationships being really important. So it will be important both observing the proprieties of it and impartial civil service, but it will be important that Keir Starmer as Prime Minister and Sue Gray, presumably as his Chief of Staff, have a really good relationship with the Cabinet Secretary, whether that's Simon Case or a successor. If Keir Starmer is thinking that he will take a couple of months to test out the runners and riders for people who might succeed Simon Case, I think that's probably a good thing, because he will want to get to know them and have confidence in them. I do think that there will need to be clarity about roles and responsibilities. That sounds like the most boring civil servicey thing to say, but in terms of who is doing what, who has delegated what responsibilities to who. We saw, for example, with Dominic Cummings, when he was the Svengali for Boris Johnson, he was also a kind of point of failure there, and a single point of failure and a bit of a logjam for some of the decisions that were coming to him. So he cared about the things he cared about, not about other things. And because everybody is looking to the Prime Minister and their most senior advisors to give a steer, as the civil servants always say, if they're not kind of keeping the system turning, then I think that could turn out to be problematic.
Jill, we're getting quite a few questions in on who's in charge. There could be, about 50 minutes when we're between prime ministers. Who's in charge then? And same question on cabinet ministers. When do the current office holders cease to hold office, and what happens in the period where nobody is in charge?
I'm not sure. I think Alex might be a better place to do that. I'm sure when he was in Jeremy Hayward's office, they were absolutely primed to do that. I just wanted to pick up, before I defer back to Alex though, Emma, I'm just quite keen to pick up on this point about roles and responsibilities. We've seen quite a lot of dysfunctional number 10s in recent administrations. I think Boris Johnson did almost every sort of variety of how to organise number 10, including having a minister as chief of staff in Steve Barclay briefly, things like that. And I do think there is a sort of quite interesting set of having people who have worked inside before, particularly Sue Gray. We hear, possibilities of filling a sort of job that sometimes exists and sometimes doesn't, of having a permanent secretary at number 10. What happens to the principal private secretary? It's somebody Rishi Sunak brought over who'd worked for him at the Treasury. Does she stay? Does she not? Do they have a view on who they want to do that job? And I think, who's going to head the policy unit? There's sort of, and how do they work then with this team? What's the relation? So I think there are a lot of those internal relationships, number 10, where actually this didn't used to be so much of an issue in the sort of very old days. Ministers basically took what they got, but now they want to bring in more people, shape number 10 more in the way that they think will work from them. And I think it's very important that people come in and have sort of clear structures that work, so people know what they're doing, rather than just give the impression that every issue is litigated and it's a bit ferrets in a sack moment over who's really in charge. But do you want to bring Alex in very quickly on where there's sort of 45 minutes of ungoverned Britain between Sunak going in and saying he resigns to the King and Keir Starmer being appointed, a bit later?
Shall I come in on that? Yeah. I mean, the honest answer actually on the kind of half an hour interregnum point is don't worry about it too much. It's fine. I think some people get very exercised about this little hiatus between the King dismissing a prime minister and then appointing another. Yes, there is a very short hiatus there, but it's in my view, this might be controversial amongst certain constitutional scholars, but it's not that important. And in practice, if something extraordinary happened in that half an hour, then it would be the incoming prime minister who just takes charge. It would be important, though, if we had an uncertain election result that might extend over days or even weeks, that the incumbent prime minister stays in office. So there is an important constitutional principle about not kind of abandoning your post and staying in Downing Street if there is a hiatus. But if it's just a few minutes, I wouldn't worry about it too much. We did have a perfect example of how things can go slightly awry, but also just how everybody kind of effectively muddles through in Liz Truss appointing her cabinet, because you asked about what happens in departments as well. The Queen died before some ministers had their seals of office. So we had this sort of half in, half out situation where a cabinet, the process of appointing a cabinet had been interrupted. And in the very British way, everyone just sort of carried on with their jobs. There would have been some kind of legal constraints on powers that a Secretary of State could exercise, but given the risk of getting too techie here, but the Secretary of State is a single sort of indissoluble office. So any Secretary of State can act on behalf of any other. So once you've appointed one Secretary of State, if there are critical legal things that need to happen, those can be done.
Salma.
Just one thing I wanted to pick up on what Jill said about sort of machinations in number 10. I think quite often what happens is departmental teams slightly get left behind when everybody's busily thinking about who's occupying what big role in number 10. And I agree that sort of, stripping it back and going back to, the old principles of why certain things are done in a certain way, I think would be very sensible for any incoming government, because all this idea of kind of like bigger teams, more political appointments and things like that hasn't really worked, and there hasn't been a model that's worked effectively. But I do think the one thing that's always missing is that discussion between number 10 and the departments, and the ability to talk cross-department as well. And I think the political network needs to remember that on top of the civil service network that speaks to each other, there needs to be perhaps formalised a political network that talks both up to the centre and across Whitehall, which quite often, I think if it's done well, can really unstick some sticky problems, and if done badly, actually compounds them. And anybody who's going in on the political side might want to think about how they structure that and how they make that work.
Got lots of questions coming in on kind of policy and how quickly a new government is going to be able to get going with legislation and their big ideas. Jill, what impact is the timing of the election going to have had? So, it's early July, relatively shortly before the usual summer recess. Is that going to affect government's ability to quickly progress policy and legislative priorities?
I actually think it's a really good timing. It may not have proved great timing electorally for Rishi Sunak, but I do think actually it's quite good timing from the point of view of good government. There are obviously some things that we expect to see done this side of any possible August recess. Of course, we don't have to have an August recess. The Prime Minister could decide that actually he's just got his hand on the lever of power, doesn't want to go on holiday instantly. But I think it would be very sensible if everybody took a bit of August off to have a bit of a rest, because although the civil service will have been taking holidays if they could have done during the last 6 weeks, we know that all the politicians will have been slogging around Britain, doing stunts or whatever to get themselves elected. So I think it's very important to remember just how tired a lot of people are. But there are things that will have to happen quite quickly. We get sort of swearing in Parliament, but then of course the first big set piece event for domestic policy is the King's speech. Before that, Keir Starmer, if it is him as Prime Minister, or Rishi Sunak on return, has to go off to the NATO summit next week. So there's a sort of very big foreign policy event. And then shortly afterwards, on the 18th of July, they're hosting all the political leaders from across Europe at the European Political Community meeting in Blenheim Palace. So there's quite a big agenda of both announcing where we're going, on foreign and security policy, really important actually, even though it's been barely mentioned during the election campaign, and a big domestic policy set piece. So we would expect to see a cut on that first legislative programme and something setting out the government's priorities. One of the things I think, though, is very good is that Rachel Reeves has indicated that she's not going to try and rush out an emergency budget this side of the summer. She's said, I need to wait for an OBR forecast. And that's one of her big themes, is she's not going to do a Liz Truss and do a big fiscal event. But I think that one of the things that ministers should be aiming to do is to set off a lot of work in departments to be done, if you like, by civil servants and outsiders. They might want to commission some of their external reviews, but I think they should be setting off a lot of policy work to come back in the early autumn for sort of decisions on how are we actually going to make progress on some important areas, some of our missions, but also on some maybe second order issues. but also doing some really important work, preparing as inputs into the sort of, you know, 1, possibly 2 spending rounds we're having, both the quick fixing budgets for 2025-26, which has to happen, or we would expect relatively soon, maybe alongside tax measures in a single budget, maybe separately, and perhaps longer timescale multi-year spending review. So I would actually be saying that ministers should go away briefly and make sure they can recharge their batteries and be ready for a really, really hectic autumn, but that they should be making the civil service do really quite a lot of work for them, with inputs from outsiders while they're away on a sun lounger for a brief pickup.
Alex, how much do we know about the advanced planning that's been done? So on legislation, on key policy priorities in the manifesto, how much advance work will opposition have done?
You just on what Jill was saying, you've got, I can hear the howls from Whitehall over to my left at Jill cancelling civil servants summer holidays. So you made yourself popular there, Jill. Advance.
But Alex, you agree with me, don't you?
I absolutely do agree with you. Yes, no, that's quite right. And actually, the civil service has had a slightly quieter period over the last few weeks. So whereas ministers have been hard at work. So potential ministers, advanced planning. I think. Clearly, a lot of planning work goes into the production of the manifesto, and you would expect an incoming government, if that's what we get, to have a pretty clear idea of the policy direction that they want to go into. I'm always a little bit sceptical. It has happened occasionally. Other people talk about it happening in the Department for Education when Michael Gove came in 2010. I'm a bit sceptical about doing too much sort of actual drafting of legislation or detailed budgeting or anything else before you get into government, because that is in the end what the civil service is there to do, is to have the lawyers to draft the legislation and to be able to advise on the financial and other situation, and to be able to set out what things cost. So what the civil service would have been doing for their part over the last few weeks is being ready to advise. Again, I don't think they won't have kind of neatly tied up with a bow, here's the bill you might want to introduce, but they should know what policy questions they need to ask ministers and get an early steer on. So you might then be able to introduce the legislation in September, say. I assume there are a few sort of symbolic pieces of legislation that the government might want to introduce, hence having that short window after Parliament comes back and the King's speech, but before the summer recess. But I think those would be fairly few and far between. I think the other thing just to mention, I did say it earlier briefly, but as well as that forward-leaning agenda, there really is quite a long list of things that ministers will have to react to. So lots of talk about prisoners. We know that public sector pay awards, so there's the strikes question, but also public sector pay will have to be settled pretty quickly after ministers come in. Talk about Thames Water being in trouble. So across departments, ministers are going to be hit with quite a lot of things, and those are just the sort of top order things. There'll be lots of other stuff that's queuing up. Appointments as well. There'll be a whole backlog of appointments that ministers will want to will need to get to grips with. So it's one of the keys for them will be balancing that kind of setting the work going with that forward agenda, while being able to react and respond to the sort of crises and mini crises that are brewing.
And then Salma, in 97, we had Bank of England independence. If the next government was going to announce a kind of big bang surprise policy on Friday, or at least in the first few days, what do you think that policy might be?
I don't actually think they've got the space to announce something big bang, because I think if the election campaign was all about steady as she goes, I mean, I know it says change, let's say it's Keir Starmer, it says change, but actually a new government is going to be walking into masses of problems, not just the things that Alex has highlighted in terms of kind of like specific issues that are coming up. You know, the bigger picture is that our growth is still slow, even though we're reaching our inflation targets. We are still not out of the woods. People are really feeling the pinch on cost of living. So doing something that's a surprise on Friday, having been so quiet on the election campaign, I think would be a misstep. I think what we might see is, as Jill has just said, Rachel Reeves is being very cautious about the budget. She wants to look at the OBR forecast. I think that might be to be able to give her some ballast to do something on taxes in the future, but they cannot do that until they're in a position to say, hey, we've come in, we've looked at the books, and guess what? Tax might have to go up. But she needs the OBR forecast to be able to justify it with the numbers. So I don't think this is going to be kind of a big reforming government. I think that if they do come in, they're going to have to take the baby steps to win that credibility, because there are going to be hard things down the line. The things that we know about, there are lots of things that we don't know about and that they don't know about that might have to change the calculation a little bit. But it would surprise me if there was something like the independence of the Bank of England on Friday, unless you know something I don't, in which case do share.
I'll sidestep that one and go straight to Jill on another big question that's coming in from the audience. How quickly do new ministers start moving to external engagement? And in particular, when might leaders of devolved administrations expect a call from the new government?
It's really interesting, and it's basically totally down to the new ministers. So if you look at things, we will have new secretaries of state for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. I know that Hilary Benn, for one, the Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, has already been spending a lot of time over in Northern Ireland meeting people over there, and you would expect that Northern Ireland offers a slightly different relationship, arguably, with Scotland and Wales. He would be there next week, I would have thought, if he's doing that. One of the controversies, I think, is how quickly does the Prime Minister do that? We saw Theresa May in 2016 go really quickly to have a meeting with Nicola Sturgeon, whatever. And I think we might see that quite early on. But one of the problems for the new Prime Minister is that he's only got 2 days next week before he's due in Washington for the rest of the week for the NATO summit. So it might have to wait for a week. In every department, people will be demanding audiences with new ministers. There will be lots and lots of pressure and advice from officials that you really need to meet the chair of this important arm's length body. You need to meet this important stakeholder group. And one of the things that's really important for the new political teams coming in with the private offices is to really decide who really is important and who do you need to see very quickly and who can you put on a slightly slower track. And there are some departments where you live or die by your stakeholder relations and others where actually it doesn't matter. So you would expect to see the new health secretary would have a very early meeting with the chief executive of NHS England. If that doesn't happen extremely soon, that would be very weird. When I was at the Treasury in 1997, obviously very quickly the governor of the Bank of England had to be hauled in to be told about the plans for Bank of England independence, which he was very happy about some of it and very unhappy about other aspects. So it'll really depend. But I would expect, quite a lot of those meetings to be happening in those first 3 weeks and then pick up again in August, September when people are back.
Thanks. Salma, what happens to existing policy? We've been talking about the fact there's going to be a lot on the new government's plate, but there's a whole host of things that are already ongoing. Do they disappear? Do they continue until new ministers tell them to stop? What happens to all of that?
Well, I think it sort of depends on, there's a manifesto, so that's obviously the first port of call. I think that it sort of depends on what's helpful. So obviously there was some actually very good legislation that was going through both on leasehold reform and renters reform. It seems like that elements of that could be picked back up. And it might be something that requires a reintroduction at the King's Speech. So there might be some overhang legislation that then is put, a new government label is put on it, and it's brought through. There could be some stuff that's just absolutely a necessity that needs to be done that the civil service will advise on. And you know, collectively, this is legislation, by the way, not policy. Policy can be done in slower time. You know, the first order of business will be, what do you get through the King's Speech? There'll be certain things that are just a requirement, and the civil service will advise on that. And I think that there'll be bits that they want to do that will come directly as a result of what's going to be available in terms of funding. So there's going to be big fiscal constraints, and I think that will have to drive a lot of what the policy agenda is going to look like. So lots of things will just stop naturally as a consequence. I think smart ministers will look at what was coming down the track and cherry pick those bits that are helpful. And I think the civil service now needs to be really clear and very articulate from the get-go about what legislation is absolutely necessary, and be smart about how certain clauses can fit into certain vehicles, and find that way of marrying with government ministers and their priorities, the things that are really important to get through.
Jill, you've got 10 seconds before I'm going to have to draw this to a close.
I'm just saying this is where the civil service needs to exercise judgment about where a new minister might be likely to want to change policy, even if they haven't expressly done that. It's a really important thing for the senior civil service to be constantly checking in on about, actually, can we just take it that we just go on doing this as we would have done under the previous administration?
Alex, final question to you. When does anyone around the Prime Minister, or indeed the Prime Minister themselves, catch up on their sleep after all of this?
Oh gosh, about 2037 probably. Yeah, it's exhausting. I mean, it goes back to what Jill said about trying to get something over the summer in terms of a break. But I suppose the serious point, and it's one that is often made, is you've got to love the history, you love the tradition, but this is a totally bizarre way of doing things, to ask sleep-deprived people who've just gone through one of the most stressful experiences of their lives to enter into an even more stressful experience and make decisions that will affect us all. But that risks sounding a little bit kind of pompous and ignoring the glories of British tradition. So we won't do that. But yeah, get some rest over the summer and then make the most of the opportunity in government, and then rest properly in 2037 when or whenever. That is not making a prediction about the length of the next government, by the way. I suddenly realised what I was saying there, so I'll shut up on that note.
On that note, that is all we've got time for. In fact, we're running 2 minutes over. So do read our fantastic explainer on what the first 72 hours brings for a new Prime Minister. Our fantastic Government Formation live blog is going to be up and running too. Jill, Alex, and lots of other IFG colleagues are going to be sharing their insights, wisdom, reaction, and expert analysis on Friday as it all plays out. And on Friday, we'll be recording a live episode of Inside Briefing, our podcast that will be going out live on Friday morning. Massive thanks to the panelists. Thank you to everybody listening in and for your brilliant questions. And I'm looking forward to following the next few days together. Bye.